All right, control valve operation. Charting the automatic brake valve with the handle with the release position brake pipe. Air flows through the number one connection to the control valve with the pipe bracket for the port number one. The brake pipe air flows to the following passages and chambers. To the chamber above the large diaphragm with a quick release valve. 2. The spring chamber with the selector valve. 3. The brake pipe chamber between the two diaphragms and service valve. 4. To the emergency brake cylinder position, limiting the valve with the brake pipe pressure opposed to the spring pressure to keep the limiting valve with the spool per valve in the downward enclosed position. 5. The chamber above the control valve with the disposition. Dissipation, checking of the valve, also through the charging of the choke J, passage number 1B, through the charging of the valve spool valve to the passage number 7A, through the selector valve spool to the passage 7B, and choke H, and the passage number 7, chamber beneath the service valve diaphragm to control the valve reservoir with the graduated release cap in the direct release position, passage number 1B, the connection directly to the passage number 7A to this cap. Through the cap, the choke of the auxiliary reserve charging and the check of the valve at which auxiliary reserve is charged. The brake pipe air pressure flow into the passage 7B of the selector valve of the spool valve also flows from the branch port past the end of the selector valve spool valve through the passage 9 and choke G and passage number 9 the selector valve of the volume chamber on the outer face of the selector valve diaphragm. With the brake pipe fully charged, the control reserve the brake pipe pressure actuating the opposite faces of the large diaphragm and the service valve identically with the service valve position diaphragm assembly, and therefore they are held in the lowermost position. The tension with the release being action with the diaphragm assembled. The end of the surface of the valve diaphragm is stemmed, drawn away from the seating contact with the application of the release check valve to allow the position number 16 and number 16A to be exhausted in the atmosphere. Service position. When the automatic brake valve handle is moved to the service position, the brake pipe pressure in port number 1 will reduce the degree determined to the amount of the brake valve handle with the movement. The reduction of the brake pipe pressure will occur when the chamber above the large service valve diaphragm. The pressure differential caused by the higher control reserve pressure acting against the outer face of the diaphragm, initiating upward movement of the service valve diaphragm assembly with the piston stem to the first close release valve, then opening to the application valve. Reduction of the brake pipe pressure allows occurs with the spring chamber, the selector valve, resulting in the pressure differential set up across the selector valve diaphragm. Move the diaphragm assembly to the spool valve and the spool valve to permit the following to occur. 1. The charging of the selector valve volume from the control reserve for the air via choke G is cut off with the spool valve. 2. The quick service action occurs as soon as the brake pipe pressure in the spring chamber has been reduced sufficiently to develop a differential across the selector valve diaphragm sufficient to move the spool valve inwardly to the position where number 1C is connected to the spring chamber. The brake pipe will flow through number 1C choke K, past the backflow check valve through the number 6A to the quick service volume in the pipe bracket. The quick service volume air dissipated through a choke C in number 6 atmosphere, passing the end of the charging valve of the spool valve. 3. When the selector valve diaphragm and spool valve assembly moved immediately with the service position, the selector valve against the body of the selector valve pressure in port number 9 acting against the outer face of the selector valve diaphragm assembled is vented to the atmosphere of the exhaust port. Selector volume overcharging the check valve. The selector volume pressure has become reduced sufficiently to bring a balance force across the diaphragm. The diaphragm assembly of the spool valve then will be moved according to outwardly spring tension with that position where the further reduction of selector valve volume pressure is terminated. When the application valve is open and described above, the auxiliary reserve air is ported to flows for the unseated application valve through the service brake cylinder and limiting the valve of the following chambers. 1. To the outer face of the charging valve diaphragm, the initiating movement of the charging valve spool of the valve, which cuts off the flow of the brake pipe air, and the quick service valve to the atmosphere. 2. The brake port 16 of the pipe bracket with the small diaphragm spool valve, quick release valve of the portion, hence the brake cylinder application number 16 pipe to the relay valve. To the large spring chamber in the service valve, where the pressure will continue to build up with the combined forces of the spring, the air pressure of the spring chamber, the brake pipe pressure will balance the force of the control reserve pressure acting upward on the large diaphragm. Whenever there is balanced position approach with the surface of the valve diaphragm assembly with the piston stem would move the downward to assume the lap position where the application valve has been positioned, the spring tension of the release valve remains. Air pressure in port number 16 and 16A builds up underside of the service brake cylinder, limiting the valve of the air until the pressure increases to the point of the adjusted limiting valve of the spring setting. When it occurs, the spool valve is moved upwardly into the position whereby the flow of the air of the application valve of number 16 is terminated with the tension, limiting the valve spring, thus limiting the maximum pressure delivered to the relay valve during the service brake application. When the higher the brake pressures are employed, it is possible to get over reduction from the 26F control valve. However, the reduction will not have any effect on the brake cylinder pressure, since the brake cylinder pressure is determined by the spring loading and service emergency brake cylinder limiting valves. Emergency position. When the automatic brake valve is moved into the emergency position, the 26F of the control valve functions similarly to described above. However, the service additional features with the control valve will be utilized as follows. As during the service of the brake application, the selector valve of the pressure reduces to the port number 9, the selector valve spool valve, atmosphere V with the selector volume overcharge of a check valve. However, the selector volume pressure is prevented from being depleted by the spring loading in the selector valve overcharge check valve, which will retain the approximately 35 to 45 psi. 2. The auxiliary supply reserve flowing from the pass of the application flows to the brake cylinder, limiting the valve to number port 16A and 16. Hence a relay valve. The chamber is provided with the brake pipe air and the emergency brake cylinder, limiting the valve of the pressure. Normally holds the emergency brake cylinder, limiting the valve of the spool. During initial stages of the emergency brake application, the emergency brake cylinder limiting the valve to remain closed. If the brake pipe pressure continues to drop, it's reduced the valve to 10 to 15 psi. For the force of the spring of the emergency brake cylinder, limiting the valve that occurs with the force brake pipe pressure in the spool of the valve. The spool valve will then move upwardly, unsealing the check valve, providing with alternate passes auxiliary reserve air to the port number 16, the relay valve. During the emergency brake application, the brake pipe pressure drops, and so that the time is so fast at the time of the emergency brake cylinder, limiting the valve of the opening check of the service brake cylinder, limiting the valve is still open, not as the position is uppermost closed position. The check valve in the emergency brake cylinder limiting will remain open to permit the continuing flow into the air relay valve. The pressure of the air emitted to the relay valve, increasing the service brake cylinder, limiting the valve of the pressure setting its reach, and continued increasing the pressure. Also, the downward force of the spool valve of the emergency brake cylinder, limiting the pressure reaches a point slightly excessive of the valve of the spring. With the spool valve will be forced downward, permitting the check valve to be seated to terminate further flow of auxiliary supply reserve air to the relay valve. The release position. When the automatic brake valve handle is moved to the release position, then increase the brake pipe pressure, and the similar pressure increase in the brake pipe chamber, the large diaphragm, the service valve. The combined force of the number 16 pressure to the brake pipe pressure, the large release spring actuating against the control reserve pressure, move the service diaphragm assembly and piston stem downward, drawing the release of the valve seating of the contact with the release of the check valve's face. The permanent number 16 port to the vent of the atmosphere with the relay valve with the service valve piston stem. Port number 10 of the pipe at the pipe bracket, the same air, and port number 16 is also vented out of the face of the charging valve. The diaphragm spring force will return to the charging valve spool and diaphragm assembly in normal charging position wherein the brake control reserve charging and reestablished. A specially graduated release cap is positioned graduated the release operation. The continued drop brake application pressure of the brake cylinder, limiting the valve permits the spring within the service of the brake cylinder, limiting the valve to move the valve downward with the building up of the brake pipe pressure. The emergency brake cylinder, limiting the valve spool valve is also held down. Both valves are normally downward position. It means the rapid exhaustion of a number 16 port of air provided increase the brake pipe pressure as the selector valve port chamber. The valve selector valve pressure will move the selector valve spool of the diaphragm assembly in the normal position, reestablishing charge and control reservoir wire selector volume reservoir to the brake pipe pressure. Independent release of the automatic brake application. When the desired release of the locomotive brakes or independently the train brakes so handle the SA26 independent brake valve must be depressed in the release position. Main air reserve will flow into the port number 13 control valve via the actuating pipe of the brake valve. The air flows through the port number 13 to the underside of the small diaphragm quick release valve with the portion of the force that overcomes the spring force of the action against the outer face of the diaphragm. The spool valve of the diaphragm assembled to move the upward position controlling the reservoir. May then flow through the spool valve on the underside of the large diaphragm. The quick release portion, pressure controlling the reservoir begins with a higher brake pressure actuating on the opposite face of the diaphragm spool valve. The diaphragm assembly, the uppermost within the spool valves, uppermost position the air of the port number 16, which is connected with the relay valves, prevented with the atmosphere, which air in the control valve of the port number 17 permitted with the vent atmosphere. The control reservoir will continue the valve with the atmosphere until the pressure is reduced approximately on the brake pipe, which is the type of the pressure differential across. Large diaphragm will be reversed. The large diaphragm assembly within the spool valve will be forced downwards, terminating the further exhaust of the control reserve air. With the atmosphere decreased, the control reserve air pressure is necessary since it must be reduced to the amount of sufficient to equalize with the brake pipe pressure to prevent reapplication of locomotive brakes upon the release of the independent brake valve. However, in order to prevent the completing depletion of the control reserve pressure when releasing the locomotive air brake following the emergency brake application, control reserve retaining check of the valve pertains approximately 20 psi control reserve pressure of the volume and the spring loaded. The purpose of the retaining control reserve pressure is to make it possible immediately to obtain an automatic brake locomotive following with such a locomotive brake after emergency brake application. J1 relay valve.